A normal person has 32 distinct ancestors 5 generations back. Margaret Theresa of Spain had 10. The same handful of grandparents kept appearing in her bloodline like a name echoing through an empty cathedral, occupying 2, 3, 4 positions in the family tree at once. Her family tree was not a tree. It was a wreath. She was 5 years old, standing in the centre of the most famous painting in Western art, wearing a silver dress, looking straight at you with dark eyes that belonged to a girl who did not yet know she'd been sold to her uncle. She was dead before she turned 22. You know the painting. Velázquez finished Las Meninas in 1656. The little Infanta, flanked by kneeling attendants, a dwarf nudging a sleeping dog with his foot, the painter himself at his easel on the left, and the ghostly reflection of her parents in a mirror on the back wall. Art historians have spent 3.5 centuries arguing about what the painting means, whether it is about seeing or being seen, whether Velázquez is painting the king or the princess, whether the mirror is reflecting reality or constructing it. None of that matters for this story. What matters is that the painting was a sales brochure. Between 1653 and 1659, Velázquez painted Margaret Theresa 3 times, the pink dress at 2, the silver dress at 5, the blue dress at 8. All 3 portraits were shipped to Vienna, to the court of the Holy Roman Emperor, so that Margaret's future husband could watch his child bride grow up from a distance. The buyer was Leopold I. Leopold was Margaret's maternal uncle, her mother Mariana's full biological brother, born to the same parents. The paintings were the 17th century version of sending photographs to a man who had already agreed to purchase a girl he had never met. Leopold was not handsome. He had the Habsburg jaw in full bloom, the protruding lower lip, the elongated face, the heavy chin that 2 centuries of inbreeding had stamped onto every generation like a brand. He was, however, a real musician and a shrewd political operator, and he wanted Margaret for a reason that had nothing to do with affection. Margaret was his claim to Spain. If her brother Charles died, and everybody expected Charles to die, Margaret's children would inherit the Spanish throne. Marrying her meant Leopold could reunite both halves of the Habsburg Empire under one crown. The girl in the painting was a territorial acquisition wrapped in silk. To understand how Margaret ended up sold to her own uncle, you need to understand the machine that made her. The House of Habsburg ran Europe for 600 years. At their peak they held Spain, the Holy Roman Empire, the Spanish Netherlands, large portions of Italy, and the entire colonial empire in the Americas and the Philippines. They built most of this not through conquest but through marriage. Their motto said it plainly: Bella gerant alii, tu Felix Austria, nube. Let others wage war. You, happy Austria, marry. Every bride was a treaty, and every child was a clause binding 2 kingdoms together by blood. The problem was arithmetic. If every marriage had to be with someone of equal dynastic rank, and the number of families at that rank in Europe could be counted on 2 hands, eventually you run out of strangers. The Habsburgs could marry the French, they could marry the Portuguese, they could marry the English, or they could marry each other. They chose each other with a frequency that turned their dynasty into the largest unintentional genetics experiment in human history. In 1556, the family split into 2 branches. The Spanish Habsburgs took Spain and its empire. The Austrian Habsburgs took the Holy Roman Empire and the hereditary Austrian lands. For the next 150 years, these 2 branches funneled their children back and forth across the same genetic bottleneck, uncle to niece, first cousin to first cousin, obtaining papal dispensation after papal dispensation to legalize unions that the Church itself recognized as incestuous. Over 80% of Spanish Habsburg marriages were consanguineous. 9 of their 11 kings ascended through unions that would be classified as incest by any modern standard. The dispensations cost political capital, but they were always granted because the Habsburgs were the Catholic Church's most powerful protectors, and nobody refuses a protector. The inbreeding coefficient tells the story in numbers. It measures the probability that a person inherits 2 identical copies of a gene from the same ancestor. Philip I, the dynasty's founder in Spain, had a coefficient of 0.025, roughly equivalent to second cousins. By the time you reach Philip III 2 generations later, the number had leapt to 0.218. Margaret Theresa sat at approximately 0.20. Her brother Charles II hit 0.254, which is higher than the offspring of a brother and sister. That number deserves a moment. Charles was more inbred than the child of full sibling incest, not because his parents were siblings, but because generations of cousin and uncle-niece unions had stacked the same ancestors on top of each other until the math collapsed. Margaret's own parents were the product of exactly this collapse. In 1646, Balthazar Charles, the only surviving son of King Philip IV of Spain, died of smallpox at 16. Philip was 41, widowed, heirless, and terrified. His dead son had been engaged to a 14-year-old girl named Mariana of Austria, who happened to be Philip's own niece, the daughter of Philip's sister, Maria Anna, who had married the Holy Roman Emperor Ferdinand III. Philip's solution was efficient and repulsive. He married his dead son's fiancée himself. The girl who was supposed to be his daughter-in-law became his wife instead. He was 44. She was 14. She called him uncle before the wedding. She called him Your Majesty after. Philip and Mariana had 5 children. 3 died in infancy. The 2 who survived were Margaret Theresa, born July 12, 1651, and Charles, born November 6, 1661, a full decade later. The 10-year gap between the surviving children tells you everything about the body count in between. Philip Prospero, the desperately awaited male heir, born in 1657, sickly from birth, suffering seizures and fevers, dead at 3. Philip wrote about this boy constantly in his letters. The child's death was one of the consuming agonies of his life. Margarita Maria and Maria Ambrosia were both dead at birth, infant after infant, gone. Philip fathered somewhere between 13 and 15 legitimate children across both his marriages. 2 survived to functional adulthood, 2 out of 15. His first wife, Elizabeth of France, gave him 8 to 10 children. Most died within days or weeks. Balthazar Charles was the miracle boy, the one son who made it to adolescence, and smallpox killed him at 16. Maria Theresa survived, married Louis XIV, lived to 44, but her own children died at appalling rates, only 1 of 6 making it. Elizabeth herself died in 1644 after miscarrying a son. The infant mortality rate among the Spanish Habsburgs was roughly 30% in the first year alone and 50% by age 10. The contemporary rate for ordinary Spanish village families, people with worse nutrition, no physicians, no royal midwives, was about 20%. The richest, most pampered babies in Europe were dying at 1.5 times the rate of peasant children. No amount of wealth could compensate for a corrupted genome. Margaret Theresa was, against those odds, healthy. Relatively. She grew up in the Royal Alcazar of Madrid, the sprawling fortress palace that had been the seat of Spanish power for centuries, surrounded by her meninas, by dwarves and dogs and the suffocating ritual of the most formal court in Europe. She was dressed in miniature versions of adult court gowns, the rigid bodices, the wide guardinfante skirts supported by hoops, the elaborate hairstyles. She was not allowed to run. She was on display from the moment she could stand. The Spanish court had rules for everything. Who could sit in the Queen's presence? Who could speak first? How many steps one took backward when exiting? Margaret learned to move within this airless machinery the way a goldfish learns to move within glass. Philip called her my joy. Mariana called her the little angel. In a family where healthy children were becoming rarer with each generation, a baby who could walk and talk and breathe without difficulty was itself something close to miraculous. The betrothal to Leopold moved through its stages with the same bureaucratic inevitability as a shipping manifest. Formal request in February 1660, when Margaret was 8. Betrothal announcement April 6, 1663, when she was 11. Marriage contract signed December 18, 1663, when she was 12. Proxy marriage in Madrid on April 25, 1666, with a man standing in for Leopold at the altar while Margaret was 14. She left Spain 3 days later. She never came back. The journey to Vienna took nearly 8 months. Madrid to Denia on the coast of Valencia, where she rested before boarding the Spanish Royal Fleet on July 16th. A stop in Barcelona, because Margaret had health problems that needed treatment before the sea voyage could continue. Across the Mediterranean, escorted by ships of the Order of Malta and the Grand Duchy of Tuscany, to Finale Liga on the Italian coast, arriving August 20th. Overland to Milan, where she spent nearly all of September trapped in a gauntlet of formal receptions, banquets and ceremonial entries, every city wanting to parade the Spanish Infanta through its streets like a trophy. Through northern Italy to Trento and Roveredo, where on October 8th she was formally handed over from her Spanish escort to the Austrian delegation. A literal transfer of possession of a 15-year-old girl from one branch of the family to the other. North through the Alps to Schottwien, where on November 25th Leopold himself rode out to meet her for the first time. He was 26, she was 15. She had been promised to him since she was 8. Before Margaret even arrived, the papal nuncio Giulio Spinola had written to the Roman Curia that there was open discussion in Vienna about the poor health of the young empress, and great fears that it might deteriorate in the colder and wetter climate of Central Europe. She had not yet set foot in the city, and her future court was already calculating how long she would last. The wedding on December 12, 1666, launched celebrations that ran for nearly 2 years. Leopold commissioned an open-air theatre near the Burggarten in Vienna, with a capacity of 5,000 spectators. For Margaret's 17th birthday, he staged the premiere of Il Pomodoro, an opera by Antonio Cesti so enormous it required 2 days to perform, over 8 hours of music, 23 stage sets designed by Lodovico Ottavio Bernascini, hundreds of costumes. Contemporaries called it the staging of the century. In the opera's finale, Paris awards the Golden Apple not to Venus, but to Margaret Theresa herself. The bride was written into mythology, made divine by the court's propaganda apparatus. Leopold also performed an equestrian ballet in her honour, riding his horse Speranza in a choreographed display designed to create the illusion of horses hovering in mid-air. A 2-year party, an 8-hour opera, a mythological apotheosis of a teenage girl. All staged to celebrate a marriage between a man and his niece that would kill the bride within 7 years and produce 4 children, 3 of whom would be dead within months of birth. The Golden Apple was already rotting. There is one detail about this marriage that sits differently from the rest. Leopold asked Margaret to call him uncle. In German Onkel, he called her Gretel, the diminutive of Margaret. She called him uncle, he called her Gretel. They shared a bed, and she was 16 when the first child was conceived. Contemporary accounts say they were genuinely fond of each other. They shared a love of music. Leopold was a skilled harpsichordist and composer, and Margaret was musical too. They attended operas together. They spent time in each other's company. By the standards of royal marriages in this period, it was apparently a warm relationship. Fondness, however, does not rewrite biology. The biology was a slow-motion wreck from the wedding night forward. Margaret Theresa maintained her Spanish identity in Vienna. She surrounded herself with Spanish attendants. She barely learned German. She wore Spanish-style clothing. She was, in a cold, wet city that would kill her, a 15-year-old Spanish girl surrounded by strangers, married to her uncle, and expected to produce an heir to the Holy Roman Empire as soon as physically possible. The courtiers watched her with the clinical detachment of livestock appraisers. The diplomatic dispatches from Vienna in these years read like veterinary reports, cataloguing her complexion, her appetite, her menstrual cycle, her weight. Some of them openly expressed the hope that the weak empress would die soon and give Leopold the opportunity of a second marriage. They were optimizing for an outcome, and women were replaceable parts in the machinery that produced it. They got their wish. From the moment Margaret arrived in Vienna, her body was given no rest. Pregnant almost immediately. From that point until her death, she was either carrying a child, recovering from labour, or grieving one she had just buried, in a loop that her body, weakened by the accumulated genetic damage of 2 centuries of inbreeding, could not sustain. She conceives right after the wedding. She is 16 years old. Ferdinand Wenceslaus is born September 28, 1667. The boy seems healthy at first. He dies January 13, 1668. 3.5 months old. Margaret is 17 and burying her first child. She conceives again quickly. Maria Antonia is born January 18, 1669. Maria Antonia survives. She's the only one of Margaret's children who will live past infancy. She conceives again while still recovering from Maria Antonia's birth. Johann Leopold is born on February 20, 1670. He dies on February 20, 1670. The same day, less than 24 hours of life, long enough to draw breath, to be held, to be named. Not long enough to see a sunrise. Margaret is 18. She miscarries. The records are sparse. Maria Anna Antonia is born February 9th, 1672. She lives 14 days. 14 days of feeding her, watching her breathe in the night, beginning to allow hope, then death. Margaret is 20. 3 of her 4 children are in the ground. Another miscarriage. She conceives again. She's 21. She has been pregnant or recovering from pregnancy almost continuously for 6 years. Her thyroid gland has begun to enlarge. A goiter. Thyroid conditions bring fatigue, sensitivity to cold, heart irregularities, disrupted fertility, increased risk of miscarriage. Whether this was driven by her inbreeding, by iodine deficiency in the Central European diet, or by the accumulated stress of continuous pregnancy, it was a visible sign that her body was breaking apart. Contemporaries described her as pale, thin, and frequently ill. Behind the operas and the balls and the formal receptions, she was a young woman far from home, physically disintegrating, trapped in a cycle of biological duty from which the only exit was death. In late 1672, 4 months into her 7th pregnancy, Margaret developed a high fever. It persisted for 8 days. The contemporary diagnosis was bronchitis. In a body already gutted by 6 years of continuous pregnancy, thyroid disease, and the accumulated genetic toll of her bloodline, it was enough. Margaret Theresa died on March 12, 1673, at the Hofburg Palace in Vienna. She was 21 years and 8 months old. She was 4 months pregnant. The child she was carrying died with her. 7 pregnancies in 6 years, 4 live births, 3 dead infants, 1 surviving daughter, and 1 dead mother who was still carrying a child when the fever took her. Leopold was at her side. A diary entry from March 13th, the day after, records that the courtiers were unable to silence his weeping. He wrote, "My heart breaks, but always may your will be done." He called her his only Margareta. He remarried within 4 months. His second wife was Claudia Felicitas of Austria, an Austrian archduchess, 19 years old, also a Habsburg, also a close relative. Leopold married her on October 15th, 1673, 7 months after Margaret's death. Claudia also became pregnant immediately. She also died young, in 1676 at 22, after 2 pregnancies in 2 years, neither child surviving infancy. Leopold married a 3rd time, to Eleanor Magdalene of the Palatinate Neuburg, who was not a Habsburg. Eleanor lived to 55. She produced 10 children, several of whom survived to adulthood. The wife, who was not a Habsburg, was the one who lived. The pattern is impossible to miss and impossible to excuse. Margaret's only surviving child, Maria Antonia, inherited the curse at a cellular level. Her inbreeding coefficient was 0.3053, higher than 0.25, which is the value produced by a brother-sister union. Maria Antonia was more inbred than the child of full sibling incest, not through a single act, but through the accumulated weight of generations of consanguineous marriages, each one ratcheting the number higher. Maria Antonia was married at 16, the same age her mother had been when shipped to Vienna. She was sent to Maximilian II Emanuel, Elector of Bavaria. She had 3 children. Leopold Ferdinand and Anton both died in infancy. Joseph Ferdinand, born October 28, 1692, survived past his first year. Maria Antonia herself died on December 24, 1692, at 23, 2 years older than her mother. The cause was postpartum complications following Joseph Ferdinand's birth, compounded by what contemporary sources describe as a deep melancholy. She traced her mother's path almost exactly, married young to a relative, pregnant immediately, dead in her early 20s from the consequences of childbirth, in a body too damaged to sustain it. Joseph Ferdinand, the grandson through whom Margaret Theresa's bloodline was supposed to inherit Spain, died in 1699 at age 6. Modern historians believe hydrocephalus, or a related condition, killed him. His death triggered the War of the Spanish Succession, one of the largest conflicts in European history, fought to determine who would inherit the empire the Habsburgs' inbreeding had made them incapable of holding. The curse moved through Margaret Theresa to her daughter, to her grandson, and then it ran out of bodies. Margaret's story cannot be told without her brothers. Charles II of Spain, born 10 years after Margaret, was the end of the line, the last Spanish Habsburg, the single most physically devastated product of royal inbreeding in recorded history. Same parents as Margaret, same uncle-niece pairing, same genetic roulette, but Charles drew the losing hand. He did not walk until nearly 4. He could not speak clearly for years after that. His lower jaw was so massively overgrown, mandibular prognathism at its most extreme, that his upper and lower teeth could not meet. He could not chew his own food. Everything had to be cut into tiny pieces or pre-chewed by servants. His tongue was too large for his mouth, macroglossia, causing him to drool constantly and rendering his speech so slurred that courtiers could barely understand him. He had epilepsy. His immune system was compromised. He had rickets. He was developmentally delayed, and he was infertile, married twice, unable to produce a child with either wife. He suffered chronic digestive problems his entire life, and by his 30s he looked elderly, his hair gone, his body wasted, barely able to stand. The Spanish called him El Hechizado, the bewitched. They believed he had been cursed by the devil. They performed exorcisms on him. They didn't understand that the curse was not supernatural. The curse was his family tree. Modern geneticists working from his symptom profile have proposed that Charles suffered from at least 2 distinct recessive genetic disorders at once. Combined pituitary hormone deficiency, a failure of the pituitary gland to produce adequate growth hormone, thyroid-stimulating hormone, and gonadotropins, which would explain his short stature, developmental delay, infertility, and premature aging. And distal renal tubular acidosis, a rare kidney disorder where the kidneys fail to properly acidify urine, producing rickets, muscle weakness, and an abnormally large head. Both conditions are caused by recessive alleles, genes that only produce disease when you inherit 2 copies, one from each parent. In a normal outbred population, the odds of that are vanishingly small. In a family where your parents share most of their ancestors, the odds climb towards certainty. Charles died November 1st, 1700 at 38. He had been king for 35 years. His mother, his wife, and his ministers had governed Spain for most of that time, because Charles was too impaired to manage the business of ruling. His autopsy was performed by the royal physicians, and the report they produced has been quoted for 3 centuries as the most devastating medical document in the history of a European royalty. His body did not contain a single drop of blood. His heart was the size of a peppercorn, his lungs were corroded, his intestines were rotten and gangrenous, he had a single testicle, black as coal, his head was full of water. The phrase suggests hydrocephalus, fluid accumulating in the brain. The peppercorn heart is either poetic language from the physicians or evidence of extreme cardiac atrophy. The black testicle speaks to the hormonal failure that made him sterile. Margaret Theresa was this man's sister. She shared his parents, his ancestry, his genetic burden. The difference between them was the roll of the dice, which alleles combined in which child, which organs buckled, which systems gave out first. Margaret drew the version that killed slowly, through failed pregnancies and a body that could not sustain what was demanded of it. Charles drew the version that destroyed from birth. 2 outcomes of the same experiment, the experiment being, what happens when you breed the same family into itself for 200 years? There is a way to make the science of this visible without a textbook. Every human carries roughly 20,000 genes, each in 2 copies, one from each parent. Some of these genes carry harmful mutations that are recessive, meaning they only cause disease if you inherit 2 copies of the broken version. In a normal population, the odds that both your parents carry the same rare mutation are tiny, because your parents come from unrelated families with different genetic histories. When closely related people have children, the math changes completely. Because they share recent ancestors, both parents are far more likely to carry the same broken gene inherited from that shared ancestor. Their children have a much higher chance of getting 2 copies of the bad version and expressing the disease. That is the mechanism. The Habsburgs triggered it over and over, generation after generation, accumulating damaged recessive alleles, the way a snowball accumulates ice rolling downhill. The immune system suffered because genetic diversity in the HLA genes, which govern immune response, was collapsing. The infants died because lethal or near-lethal recessive alleles that would almost never appear in an outbred child were appearing constantly. The jaw grew worse because mandibular prognathism followed a recessive inheritance model. A 2019 study led by Professor Roman Vilas at the University of Santiago de Compostela recruited 10 maxillofacial surgeons to diagnose facial deformity in 66 portraits of 15 Habsburg dynasty members, then calculated the inbreeding coefficient of each individual using a family tree of 6,000 individuals across 20 generations. The degree of jaw deformity correlated directly with the inbreeding coefficient. You can line up Habsburg portraits from Maximilian I to Charles II and literally watch the jaw get worse. The paintings are the data, the face is the graph. A 2009 study published in PLOS ONE analysed 502 pregnancies across 71 Habsburg families between 1450 and 1800. 93 infant deaths before age 1, 76 child deaths between ages 1 and 10. The higher the parents' inbreeding coefficient, the more likely their children were to die. The correlation was statistically significant, not coincidence, not bad luck, not divine punishment. Though the Habsburgs spent enormous sums on prayers and exorcisms trying to treat it as exactly that. A 2024 study published in the American Journal of Human Biology found that inbreeding affected the mothers too. Habsburg women with higher coefficients had higher rates of pregnancy complications, miscarriage, and death in childbirth. Margaret Theresa, destroyed by 7 pregnancies before her 22nd birthday, is the textbook illustration. The worst part of the story is the ratchet. Each generation of inbreeding increased the coefficient. Each increase exposed more recessive alleles. Each exposure produced more disease and death. The sane response would have been to marry outside the family. The Habsburgs did the opposite. They doubled down, marrying even closer relatives in a desperate attempt to consolidate the dynastic holdings that the inbreeding was already destroying. A feedback loop. Inbreeding caused problems, problems caused desperation, desperation caused more inbreeding, worse inbreeding caused worse problems. The ratchet only turned one direction. The Spanish Habsburg line ended with Charles. He left no children. He left no heirs. He left a kingdom that his mother, his wife, and his ministers had been running for years because he was too broken to govern. The Spanish throne passed after the War of the Spanish Succession to the House of Bourbon. The Habsburgs' 200-year grip on Spain was finished. The cause of death of the dynasty was not war, not revolution, not economic collapse. It was their own DNA. They accumulated so many damaged recessive alleles that their last king could not eat, could not speak clearly, could not walk properly, could not reproduce, and died with organs that had never functioned correctly. They bred themselves to extinction. Go back to the painting, Las Meninas, the girl in the silver dress. Look at the portraits in order if you want to understand what the Habsburgs did. The pink dress, 1653, aged 2. Margaret is tiny, round-faced, pale. She looks like a normal toddler squeezed into an absurd adult-style gown. The jaw's not visible yet. She could be any child. Las Meninas, 1656, age 5. The face is longer now. The lower lip is slightly fuller than it should be. The first whisper of the mandibular prognathism that defines her bloodline. She is still beautiful, still luminous, still a child who does not know what waits for her. The blue dress, 1659, age 8. She is visibly a Habsburg. The face is long and pale, the eyes large and dark, the lower lip protruding slightly more. The expression is grave, almost adult. She has been told by now that she is engaged to her uncle. She is 8 years old and she knows her future. Then the Viennese portraits painted by Juan Bautista Martinez del Mazo and Jan Thomas van Yperen after her arrival in Austria. The girlhood is gone. She's a teenage empress in a slabric court dress. Her face thinner, her expression strained. If you lay these images side by side in chronological order, you are watching a little girl being consumed by her own bloodline in real time. Line up all the Habsburg portraits from Maximilian I to Charles II, and the jaw follows the same arc. A suggestion in Maximilian, visible in Philip II, pronounced in Philip IV, and then Charles II, where the jaw is so overgrown the man could not eat solid food. The 2019 Velas study proved the correlation. The higher the inbreeding coefficient, the worse the deformity. 22% of the variation in jaw severity across the dynasty was explained by inbreeding alone. The portraits are not just art, they are a medical record painted in oil. She's 5 years old, luminous, serious, standing in the middle of a room full of people whose entire purpose is to serve her. She does not know that she has been sold to her uncle. She does not know about the 8-month journey, the pregnancies, the dead babies, the goiter, the fever, the 8 days. She does not know that she will be dead at 21. She does not know that her only surviving daughter will repeat her fate almost exactly, or that her brother will be born so damaged that physicians will find a peppercorn where his heart should have been. She's 5 years old, and she's looking straight at you. She's been looking straight at you for 370 years. The Habsburgs did not understand genetics. They did not know about recessive alleles or inbreeding coefficients. They knew only that their children kept dying. Their answer, every single time, was to marry closer, breed faster, try again. Margaret Theresa was what they got. The girl they painted, the girl they sold, the girl they used up. She was 21 years old. She was 4 months pregnant when she died. The child she was carrying never drew a breath.